Okay. Okay. All right. I'll give it another minute or so just to see if we have a few more people coming in. And Leah, if you see anyone that needs to be admitted once I've already started, if you don't mind admitting them, that would be great.
No problem.
Thanks. Okay, well, I will go ahead and make a start. So I'm Amity, and I am many things. I wear many hats, but tonight I'm talking to you with my reproductive health and rights activist hat on, and of course, as the resource and training lead for White Ribbon Alliance UK, who's hosting this workshop tonight. And it's about reproductive rights in the post-Roe era. So a little bit about me, which will make it make sense of why I'm talking about this. If you couldn't tell already from my accent, I'm originally from the States, and I've lived in the UK for over 20 years now. And I'm background is in midwifery. I'm a former midwife, and I've worked in abortion care as well as a midwife, providing abortion care in South London. And I'm also a abortion activist. I have been involved with organizing demonstrations and activism within that space, within the reproductive rights space, and now in my role for White Ribbon Alliance. So just to reiterate to everyone that this is a pro-choice, pro-abortion space, and that there might be differing viewpoints, that respectful conversations are encouraged, but if there is any anti-choice rhetoric or insensitive language, that won't be tolerated. And if you do find the topic gets emotive at all for you and you need to leave, that's absolutely fine. Please do look after yourself and your own emotional well-being. So my mission really is to normalize talking about abortion. I think it's something that is still very taboo. I think it's becoming slightly less taboo and is being talked about a bit more frequently, but there is still a lot of sort of secrecy or shame or guilt around it sometimes, or at least a presumed secrecy and guilt. Sometimes people presume that anyone who has had an abortion will feel secretive about it and not want to discuss it. But more and more frequently, we're seeing that people are talking about their experiences and that a lot of people find that really helpful. And I know that for myself, I have a personal experience with abortion as well. And hearing people talk about their experiences openly was certainly very normalizing for me and helps to remove some of the stigma around it. So it's something I feel really passionate about, that we talk about it not only as a necessary form of healthcare, but also just as to break down that social stigma as well. Because in my time working in abortion care, I frequently would look after women who were having a surgical termination. And, when I asked if there was someone to pick them up or to be with them, to support them, many times the answer was no, I haven't told anyone. And I always found that really upsetting, that they felt like they couldn't tell anyone, not even a friend or a family member. So that's my mission, is to try to help normalize it as much as we can. And a lot of people are often surprised that, being a midwife with my background in midwifery, that I worked in abortion care. And actually, yes, it is a thing. And people are often surprised to learn that. But a lot of abortion services in the UK, at least, actively seek out midwives to provide abortion services. Not only because of our, skills and background with supporting women, but also with the clinical skills that are necessary. A lot of that is midwifery related as well. So while there's many roles within abortion care, midwives and nurses and doctors and healthcare assistants, ultrasound scanners, and so on, there is a very much a place for midwives in abortion care. So some of the midwives' role in abortion is in what you would kind of expect, with advocacy, support, providing clinical care, doing health promotion, providing information, and actually providing contraception, safeguarding, signposting to other services and information they might need to be able to make informed choices or to get aftercare, and then providing a judgmental and safe and confidential service above all. That's what is most important to many people. And just to give a little bit of context around who has abortions, because this is another side of this, the stigmatization that I think happens a lot, is there's a lot of misunderstanding publicly around who is having abortions. Clearly, this will differ from country to country. So these are the UK stats for 2022. And these are just some of the changes that were from the previous year's stats. So when I was looking at the 2021 stats, the largest increase in that year had actually been amongst the 34 to 39 age group, I believe. And whereas in 2022, the largest increase was amongst those aged 25 to 29. And there's been some suggestion that that potentially has a lot to do with the cost of living crisis for all age groups, I would imagine. 54% of those who sought abortions were already mothers, and 86% had medical abortions with pills, and 88% of those were less than 10 weeks gestation when they had their termination. 77% were white, 9% Asian, 8% Black, and 5% mixed or biracial. And 2/3 have a partner or are married at the time that they were seeking abortion care. So I just think it gives an interesting context because if you ask somebody kind of on the street who maybe doesn't know a lot about abortion care, some of the assumptions are that the vast majority are not already mothers, are very young, and that they're having, I think a lot of people overestimate as well how many people are having terminations past the point in which they can no longer have a medical abortion with tablets. And that's the cutoff for that is 9 weeks and 6 days. So anybody who's 10 weeks gestation and over usually requires a surgical termination. And there's a lot of misconceptions around how many people are actually using that service. And as we can see from the stats here, 88% were less than 10 weeks and 86% were able to complete that procedure with the pills that they were able to take. The reason that access to safe abortion care is so important is clear to see. We know this from history. It has been around as long as people have been being born, and 6 in 10 unintended pregnancies today end in an induced abortion. Worldwide, there are at least, and these are only of the places where we're reporting these deaths, 23,000 deaths per year from unsafe procedures or lack of access. The estimated figure is probably realistically higher. And the lack of abortion services is definitely a human rights and public health issue. We know without a shadow of a doubt that when abortion is removed as a viable, safe option in a healthcare setting, that it does not go away, it goes underground. And we know that they continue to happen and sometimes still safely. It's not to say that all unlicensed abortions are always completely unsafe, but that it leads to a higher incidence of incidences where people are put in situations of having unsafe abortions or going with practitioners who don't have the appropriate setting or knowledge or tools to do those safely. If at any point anybody has any questions, please do raise your hand. We will be doing questions at the end as well, but if I don't see you raise your hand and you want to say anything, then please do. You can also put any questions in the chat and I will try to keep an eye on that as well. Right, so this is a really helpful map from the Reproductive Rights Center for Reproductive Rights, and they have a really great interactive map. If you've not seen it before, I really encourage you to go and have a look at it. It's a really great map, and it covers its worldwide map. So you can go and you can click on different countries and read about what the current abortion laws are there and what access the people who live there have. It's usually pretty up to date, so definitely go and have a look. As you can see here, so the green countries, the countries that are highlighted in green are where it's mostly freely available, and it varies on gestations though, but you don't necessarily need to cite a reason. And while that looks like quite a large percentage because of the massive land mass that covers, because it's mostly Russia and Canada and some of the larger countries that have that in place, and in reality, that's still a fairly low number of countries. We also have large swathes of Africa where they're only permissible to preserve health or to save the mother's life. And then the countries that are in blue, those are countries where it is permissible on broad social or economic grounds. So that includes places like India and the UK, it falls under that category. And then, as you can see in the US, there's a mixture of it being prohibited altogether or it's prohibited at the state level. So this is just a zoom in on Europe for those who aren't as familiar with the laws in Europe. So almost all European countries have some level of abortion access. The gestations do vary greatly, which I'll come on to in a minute. And the way that it's accessed is different as well. So as you can see, and some people are quite surprised by this in the UK actually has more restrictions than a lot of countries, and that it is still illegal until and unless certain criteria are actually met. So some of the gestation limits in Europe, you can see here, the UK does have the highest at 24 weeks as the cutoff. So actually 23 weeks and 6 days. So it can't be 24 weeks or over. Netherlands is second at 22 weeks. And then we have Sweden at 18, Austria and Spain at 14. And then the majority of the other Western European countries are at 12 weeks, with Portugal being the lowest at 10 weeks. So coming on to Roe v. Wade, this was the ruling that really began to change a lot. It's not to say that there weren't things already happening before, and indeed in many countries across the world, this is, abortion access has been restricted and has always been restricted or has been removed when it was permissible previously. So the US is not a completely special case in this, but obviously it's in the news more, it's been more well broadcasted and well known, and a lot of people know about the Roe v. Wade case. So just a very quick recap for anyone who's not familiar. Roe v. Wade was the Supreme Court ruling that made abortion legal in the United States in 1973 in all states. And so when in May 2022, news leaked that the Supreme Court was actually going to be overturning that ruling, which was published in June. So it was a premature leak that came out in the media. So we kind of knew it was going to happen in the May, but it didn't actually come through until the June. But that's when everybody started to kind of to get the sense of what was actually happening. Excuse me. So this was a demonstration that I organized at the US Embassy the weekend after that news broke. There were other demonstrations as well from other organizations in the UK. This one I organized not as a member of White Ribbon Alliance UK, but just as myself, as an American woman living in the UK who was very upset at what I was seeing happen, and wanted to just go and make my voice heard, really. So I literally just put up a post on Facebook saying that I was going to be holding this event and posted it in some groups and showed up on my own, dressed as a handmaid. And you can see in the photo on the left, if you can see in the background, there's two police officers there with automatic weapons, which was a bit unnerving because as soon as I showed up and stood up on that podium with my megaphone, they came over and asked what we were up to, because they patrol the perimeter of the embassy. They were actually very nice, I have to say. They weren't aggressive at all. They didn't say we had to leave. They wanted to know more, like how long we might be there, how many people we were expecting, and whether we were expecting any anti-choice counter protesters to show up. So I think they were more just interested in making sure that it didn't get out of control and that nobody got hurt. So that was actually very nice of them, but it was still a bit unnerving to be speaking with men with large guns behind me. But hey, I'm American, so I'm used to that, right? So yeah, so that was a really great coming together of people. We were sharing stories, sharing things that we'd written about our own experiences, or just about what this overturning meant to us emotionally and legally and practically and in just every way possible. So it was a really great coming together of people. So this is the current situation in America. We have 26 states that have completely banned or are hostile to abortion. So those are the states that are in the dark red or the slightly lighter red. And then we have 24 states where it remains legal or accessible in some form. It's not completely banned, and there is at least some level of access. Though even in some of those 24 states, there might only be very few clinics for that entire state. So people are still having to wait a while for appointments and maybe travel across a state, which can still be several hours drive. And around 40 million women are now living in areas without abortion access when they weren't previously. One of the most important things I wanted to talk about tonight is, even though a lot of people were shocked about the overturn of Roe, if you have at all been keeping your eye on what happens in abortion, or you work in reproductive rights or advocacy, you might be aware of some of this. But I think it's really important that, especially in the UK, where there might be a sense of complacency that, we don't really have a lot of this, a ton of this anti-choice rhetoric, though we're going to talk about that again later. We don't have, such extreme measures like, there were abortion clinics still today, but particularly through, I remember in my sort of teen and 20s years, seeing abortion clinics be threatened with bombs or even bombed, abortion doctors being killed or attempted to be killed. So working in that environment is obviously a danger. I don't think we obviously don't have that same level of antipathy and social division in the UK, but it's still really important that we talk about how the events that led up to Roe being overturned, because some of them are really insidious and really subtle, but it all builds this layer cake of how we start to diminish people's rights, and especially with the rise of more populist and far right groups throughout the UK, I think it is definitely something we need to be aware of and concerned about. So some of the lead up to Roe, if you bear in mind that it only passed in 1973, was when it became enacted. Already by 1976, we had the Hyde Amendment, which banned the use of Medicaid-funded abortion services for impoverished women, except in some states in the cases of rape or incest. So Medicaid is for people on low income or living in poverty, to access some level of health care. So when they banned the use of any Medicaid funds for abortion services, clearly that was going to leave many people without access to abortion. And paying privately for abortion in the States is quite expensive. Even for a pretty straightforward early gestation termination, it can cost hundreds of pounds, of dollars even. Up to thousands if they're a later gestation or require surgical input, they require anesthesia and so on. So the more advanced the pregnancy is, or if they've lacked access and then are at a higher gestation when they are able to get that appointment, the higher the cost is. And of course, having to have time off work, travel across state, so on. Then we had the Mexico City policy in 1984, and that restricted US federal funds from being utilized by international NGOs that provided abortion counseling or referrals, advocated to decriminalize abortion or even expand access. And this obviously led to a decrease in contraception and family planning services in developing countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And this led to an increase in abortion rates, unsurprisingly, I should say, HIV and maternal mortality rates. And this policy has been enforced by every Republican president since 1984. And then every time a Democratic president comes into power, they lift it. So it's literally been a game of back and forth of whoever's in power. It's enacted and then it's lifted and so on. So you can see how clearly divided that is between party lines for the US. Then just the very next year, in 1985, we had the Kemp-Kasten Amendment, and that restricts US funds from being utilized by the UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, and to provide abortion care internationally. And again, that's been enforced by every Republican president ever since 1985 and lifted by every Democratic president. Then in 1992, we had Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which was quite an important case in some ways. And you might, if you've read about this case at all, it can be a bit confusing as to whether it was a positive thing or a negative thing for abortion. In some senses, it upheld Roe, so it was a ruling that was challenging Roe, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of upholding it. So in that way, it was positive. But on the other hand, they included some caveats that allowed states to implement laws and tactics that made it more difficult to access. So things like mandatory ultrasounds, having to have a waiting period of 24 to 48 hours or more, and having parental permission if you're under 18 and so on. So clearly that made it much more difficult to access for a lot of people, particularly, again, if they already were disadvantaged or impoverished or were not in an area with ready access. So people who live in care deserts or have to travel far anyway for any healthcare were obviously more adversely affected than anyone else. And then 30 years later, almost to the day, we had Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, and that is the ruling that eventually overturned Roe v. Wade. So that was a case brought in Mississippi in 2018 that banned abortion after 15 weeks, which was greatly influenced by the Christian anti-choice group called the Alliance Defending Freedom, so ADF. They were the primary group that had been campaigning for the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and it wasn't just this one case that they had put forward. This has been a long, slow process since the late 70s, early 80s. There's been a strategic process amongst some right-wing Christian fundamentalist groups and very conservative political groups who joined forces and actually, had a strategy and would seek out test cases around the country to try to get something in front of the Supreme Court that could test Roe. And that finally happened in the 2018 Mississippi court case that eventually became the Supreme Court ruling that overturned it. So you can see that this is not just a chance case that happened to come up that got overturned. This has been a very detailed and methodical strategy that's been going on. I think it's also important to bear in mind the social context and factors in the United States that also led to some of the public support for the overturn of Roe v. Wade, because even though, again, the majority of Americans, when polled, do actually support abortion as a right, there is a lot of caveats that are put onto that. Well, yes, but in cases of X, Y, or Z, people have very different views on when and how it should be allowed, but it still remains the fact that a majority do not want to see it completely outlawed, as it has been in some states. So some of the social factors that have led to that support from some parts of the public are obviously the Christian fundamentalism, anti-choice propaganda in the right-wing media, which influences people's opinions on it, anti-choice groups that are influencing politicians and political agenda. So lots of donating going on from anti-choice groups to politicians and their political action groups called PACs. The subjugation of women and misogyny, clearly. Poverty and undereducation, particularly with lack of sexual health information. So we know that places where there's being taught abstinence only, waiting for marriage, that is leading to higher rates of pregnancy, particularly among teens, and lack of access to healthcare, regardless of age or the region of the person. If there's lack of access to healthcare in general, even for getting antenatal care, that they're more likely to be able to struggle to access that kind of healthcare. Even for people who have wanted pregnancies, they're more at risk of having a miscarriage, even for a wanted pregnancy, if they're not able to access that healthcare and sexual healthcare. And then the increasingly far-right ideologies that frankly just seek to oppress anyone outside the white Christian hetero male demographic. So it is a complex issue in the United States. It is very politically divided, and it's very much driven by religion, which again we know is not quite as big of a social division in the UK. But again, it's something we need to be mindful of because, as we're going to talk about very shortly, that is something that we're seeing more of in this country too. The real life consequences of not having abortion access in the United States is very real. So in many states, as I've mentioned earlier, abortion is impossible or very difficult to access, even in cases of rape or incest, even where the woman's health or life are endangered, and even when there are fetal abnormalities incompatible with life. So it's not only about access, it's a human rights violation on every possible level. It's actually really cruel. Basically, women are already dying from this law. There were 2 women in Georgia just recently who actually died. One from an abortion that she wasn't able to procure in time, and another from a wanted pregnancy where she was refused care because her life wasn't in danger enough for them to act. And sadly, she actually passed away before she could get that care. So what's happening a lot is that people are going in, whether it was a wanted or an unwanted pregnancy, and in the vast majority of cases, it was actually a wanted pregnancy. A woman goes into hospital seeking care because she's miscarrying or she's suffering with another health condition that is being exacerbated by the pregnancy. And the only viable way to save her life or to prevent her from having even more morbidity or injury to herself or illness is to remove the pregnancy, to have a termination. And healthcare providers' hands, they feel like their hands are tied because they're being threatened with prison sentences and legal action if they act. And they are having to literally be on the phone with their lawyers, with the hospital lawyers, saying, is she sick enough for us to intervene? And it's literally a balancing act between the healthcare professionals with a woman who is very ill in front of them. And the healthcare professional knows what needs to be done to prevent it or to solve the problem. But they're being told by their managers and bosses and their hospital's legal team that they cannot legally act until the woman is so gravely ill that not doing so would be certain death. But of course, that leads to so many deaths that were unnecessary if they had acted sooner. So it's very, very cruel, and they're being denied this treatment and care. Um, and then, yeah, medical staff are being forced to allow her health to deteriorate. And then that's causing staff to leave those states where this is happening because, of course, I can understand, as a healthcare professional myself and who's worked in abortion care, I cannot imagine how awful it is to have to sit there and watch somebody basically die in front of you or deteriorate in front of you when you know exactly what you could do to help them and to save their life and not being allowed to do it without being charged with a crime or imprisoned. It's really horrible, and it's not only creating a dearth of people providing abortion care, but it's also making people leave states where abortion is restricted or completely illegal. And so it's also creating a dearth of providers for obstetric and maternity care. So even people who are still in that state with wanted pregnancies and are carrying that pregnancy to term, they are being put at higher risk because now the staffing in those hospitals is lower and there's not as much expertise around because some of the more senior doctors and nurses are leaving because they can't bear to watch this unfolding in front of them. So it's actually creating a really horrible knock-on effect on even those who had wanted pregnancies, and they're not going to be able to get the care that they need either. So as you can imagine, the people who are most disproportionately impacted by this are women living in poverty or on low incomes, those with young children because of the problems with being able to get childcare, time off work, and so on. Women living in rural areas or in care deserts where reproductive care of any kind is difficult to access. Trans and non-binary people because of the fear of them being judged or censured or not being treated appropriately or misgendered. Women of color, migrants and refugees who are too afraid to seek care, younger women and girls who might have to seek permission from a parent or have to arrange to get to a clinic in another state, and somebody might not be able to take them because then they'd be transporting a minor over state lines, which is a felony. So that's more difficult for them to be able to access care out of state. Victims of rape or incest and those without good access to contraceptive services in the first place will obviously find it harder to access abortion services. And just wanted to come back quickly to what I said about the transportation of minors over state lines. This is something that some of you may be familiar with from Texas. So there's what's commonly called the vigilante law, and anyone transporting anyone across state lines, regardless of whether they're underage or not, can actually be penalized and imprisoned for taking that person in a car to another state to seek that care. So, and they actually give rewards and financial rewards, like monetary awards to people for turning in anyone who either had an abortion or took someone to have an abortion in another state. So it's very much a vigilante kind of outlaw mentality that they're encouraging there, which is obviously I don't need to say how horrifying that is, but it's actually encouraging people to turn in members of their family and community for financial reward. And some people have done it just because they're so desperate for money because of their living in poverty. So it just adds an extra layer of disgustingness on top of it, I think. Right. These are just a couple of books I wanted to recommend if you're interested in learning more about the climate of abortion in the United States. The book on the left there that I'm holding is called Handbook for a Post-Roe America. This book was actually published before Roe got overturned, 2 or 3 years before that, I believe. And it was very clear, like, this is going to happen. It's just a matter of when. And I found that really interesting. That's what really opened my eyes, was reading that book, because I'd always thought, yes, it's possible, but not likely. And when I read that book, and the author, Robin Marty, was so clear that it is going to happen, it's a matter of when, that's when I really started to wake up to the fact that this was going to happen. But it's a really great book that gives lots of tips for basically how to form your own underground network of abortion providers and suppliers, women supporting women, communities helping each other, because as we know, abortion never stops. It doesn't matter if you restrict it, outlaw it, people will keep having abortions. They will keep seeking out that care, and there always will be women and people who will provide that care as well. So in some ways, even though it's horrible, I find that really heartening that there's a whole community of people out there who are still doing this work and who are committed to making sure that as many people as possible can access the care that they need. And then the book on the right, which is called Shout Your Abortion, that's filled with really great stories from people about their abortion experiences, most of them positive, not all, but we hear lots of the list of woes, as I call it. And even very well-meaning left-wing pro-choice people do this. And it's something I speak about a lot in my activism. You may have seen there was, around the time of Roe v. Wade, getting overturned, there was a particular meme kind of going around of, her name is such and such, and she was, a teenager, and she was assaulted by her uncle, and now she's pregnant, and I had this whole long list of all these women and girls' names that, and what happened to them. And though I understand the rationale and the reasoning behind doing that, because they're trying to elicit some kind of empathy from people who are really anti it in any case, I think it's actually really harmful, because it still is cementing in people's minds that you have to have this really life-threatening or really heart-wrenching or horrible story in order to be able to access abortion care and to not feel stigma and shame for it. There's very little in the way of positive stories about abortion in the media. There's very little in the way of, saying, you know what, you can have an abortion just because you don't want to raise a child or you don't want to be pregnant. You don't have to have a valid reason. And I talk very openly about my own experience about having an abortion when I was a married mother of two, financially stable, could have done, and no real health reasons why I couldn't have done it, had smooth pregnancies before. I simply did not want to have another child, and I did not think I would be a good mother to my existing children if I had another child, and it would have severely impacted my mental health. And I think it's really important we talk about those stories and not always focus on the, woman living in poverty with 6 kids already and the rape victim. And even though that's very important that we talk about their stories too, we need to also talk about the fact that it's just a normal part of a lot of women's life. 1 in 4 or 1 in 3, depending on what country you're in, women will have an abortion, and we need to normalize talking about it as not always this really difficult decision. It's not always a difficult decision for some people. Of course, everyone thinks it through thoroughly. Nobody does it on a whim, but it's not always this heartrending, awful choice. Sometimes it's a positive thing for people's lives. Right, before we move into the UK, if anyone has anything they want to share or any questions at this point, this would be a good time. Anything about what we've talked about so far that you wanted to ask a question about or comment on? I will carry on then, but if you think of anything, please do put it in the chat or feel free to raise your hand and I will come to you when I can. So, abortion law in the UK. At the current, I'll go through the past and then we'll come to the current situation. So at the moment, we have the Offenses Against the Person Act, which was passed in 1861, which made abortion a crime punishable by life in prison. That law is still on the books. Okay, it is not actually changed. It is still a crime punishable by life in prison. The Abortion Act of 1967 gave an exception to this law that an abortion can be performed by a registered professional only if two doctors agree that it meets one of the four exemption criteria. The most common one of the four is C, or the third one, and that's that the continuance of the pregnancy would involve risk to the life of the pregnant woman greater than if the pregnancy were terminated. So a lot of abortions fall under that one. And in my experience working in abortion care, the vast majority of abortions that were being sought in a clinic outside of the NHS were meeting that criteria. The other ones include, via include for fetal abnormalities or if the mother's life is threatened, but typically those ones are taking place in NHS hospitals because they're usually a higher risk pregnancy. But yeah, the vast majority of ones that are taking place outside of a hospital and the majority of abortions in the UK do take place in an outsourced clinic. The vast majority are done under that exemption. Sorry, I just saw that there might have been a hand up. No, okay, fine. So abortion is still technically illegal unless those exemptions are met. And then you have to have two doctors agreeing that the termination can take place. So if two doctors can't agree, or neither of them agree that they agree to the termination, that they don't think a valid reason has been given, then they can legally and rightfully decline to do it, and it will not be done. It doesn't happen very often, but I have seen it happen in even the short year and a half that I worked in abortion services. I have seen a handful of instances where the two doctors weren't satisfied with the reason given, and so declined that person's request to have a termination. And abortion is still illegal unless those conditions are met, and I think we really have to remember that. And it's actually, except for in Northern Ireland, where and they have abortion has only become legal there so recently, but they actually, in some ways, have more lenient law, and that you don't have to have a reason, you don't have to cite a reason, and you don't need the permission of two doctors in Northern Ireland up until 12 weeks. So for early pregnancies, Northern Ireland actually has a more relaxed and liberal law than England, Wales, and Scotland. After 12 weeks, abortion is not available really at all in Northern Ireland. So if you live in Northern Ireland, you don't need to cite a reason and meet one of those criteria up to 12 weeks. But after 12 weeks, you're most likely going to have to travel to another country to have the termination done. And as far as how it works in the UK with abortion, so the vast majority of terminations take place at one of the outsourced clinics. So they're NHS funded, but they take place outside of the NHS, usually with a charity or a nonprofit organization. So the main ones that most people will know of are BPAS, the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, MSI, which used to be Mary Stopes International, NewPass, and the NHS does do them, but generally tends to reserve their slots because there aren't as many for people who are higher risk, who don't meet the criteria to have a termination in a clinic, who can't have a medical abortion with pills, or are of a higher gestation for fetal abnormality. So no abortions can take place in an outsourced clinic that is not set in a hospital if they are past the legal limit, even if there's a fetal abnormality that's detected after that. That would have to take place in an NHS hospital. And access to medical abortion, so with pills before 10 weeks, that actually has improved, with those meeting the criteria, able to complete the process at home since 2020, when telemeds became legal. So that's the time I was working in abortion care. And luckily, very quickly, because I remember how much we thought, oh my gosh, when the pandemic hit and I was working in a clinic, we thought, oh, they're not going to be able to access abortion care, because we just assumed that the government would probably say, this isn't a vital, important service. It will probably just be cut off. And actually, much to our surprise, it was thankfully prioritized. And there was very quickly a telemeds law passed. It was supposed to be just temporary for the pandemic, but that allowed us to finally start being able to assess people over the phone for low risk people who were having, who were under the 10 weeks gestation based on their last period. And we were satisfied that they met the criteria and that there were no health conditions that would prevent them from carrying out the abortion at home. We were able to post them the meds for them to take at home, because previously they would have to come into a clinic, take the first tablet, and then come back the next day often and take the second lot of tablets and then have to immediately go home. And that's not ideal, not only because of the inconvenience of having to come to a clinic twice, and they usually had to come in even before that to have an ultrasound done. So this was a lot better for people for access. So it was great. And now, thankfully, the telemeds temporary law became permanent law. So that is now in place and protected, which is fantastic. Because we want people, if they are going to have a termination, to get it as quickly as they can, as safely as they can, and telemeds is definitely the way to do that. For surgical abortions, though, and those who don't meet the criteria for having telemeds, access is still unequal across regions of the UK and often requires significant travel, especially for those who are seeking a termination at a slightly later gestation, so over around 14 weeks. There are fewer centers that can and have the means to do the higher gestations. So because it requires a bit more stay in the clinic, it requires a bit more input, and also mainly because it requires more surgical specialty. So there are actually very few doctors and surgeons who perform terminations up to the legal limit of 23 plus 6 weeks. So people often have to travel if they are needing a termination at later gestation. They often have to travel quite a long distance across the UK. So they're still being affected by having to stay in hotels, the cost of travel, train fare. We also would get people coming over from European countries where the gestation limits were a lot lower, of like 12, 14 weeks. So yeah, there was still getting people traveling into the UK to access care over here as well. Of course, they had to pay privately if they were coming from another country. So that was another issue. It was a lot more money for them. Whereas from the UK and you're eligible for NHS care, then it's funded by the NHS. But having to travel at all really for reproductive care, it just compounds the disadvantages that are already there, and for those who are already most negatively affected. So these are some of the attempts to restrict abortion in the UK that we've had over the years. So in 2008, there were several votes held in Parliament to reduce the term limit for abortion. So you can see here what some of the votes were. So they did these in separate votes, but you can see that not as many, but still 71 MPs, sitting MPs at that time, voted to reduce the legal limit from 24 weeks to 12 weeks, which is a huge drop. 84 voted to reduce it from 24 to 16, 190 to reduce it down to 20 weeks, and 233, so almost fairly even, who voted to reduce the gestation from 24 to 22 weeks. So even though that's not, it seems like abortion is still pretty safe as far as that vote goes, and that's the last time there was a major vote on abortion. It's still worrying that there's still quite a few people, quite a few sitting MPs who would like to see the gestation limit lowered. Also, the thing that a lot of people don't know in the UK is that there was a pro-life all-party parliamentary group, an APPG, that operated just until last year with 25 sitting MPs, or in fact until this year when the Tories were voted out of power, that had 25 sitting MPs in that party, including Maria Caulfield, who was the Minister for Women's Health Strategy from 2022 to 2024. And 15 of those MPs lost their seats in this most recent general election, but which is great news, of course. But that means 10 of those MPs who were in the pro-life APPG are still sitting MPs and actively campaigning for a lowering either in the limits or in the outlawing of abortion altogether. And Fiona Bruce, she was a former MP and Rishi Sunak Special Envoy of Freedom of Religion and Beliefs, attended and spoke at events paid for by the UK branch of the Alliance Defending Freedom group, which was behind the overturning of Roe v. Wade while she was in office, which is, of course, concerning. So again, we're going to talk about these groups and how they're infiltrating the UK more frequently now. So the ADF has doubled its spending in the UK since 2020, and it was a stakeholder in that pro-life APPG that we just discussed with direct access to MPs. So they're sitting in on these meetings, forming relationships, potentially donating funding to their campaigns or their constituencies in other ways, and just having access to them. So clearly that's worrying. And then we have the Right to Life campaign group, amongst others, but they're one of the biggest ones that has increased its activity and advertising on social media since 2020. And the Center for Bioethical Reform UK uses very graphic images and compares abortion to genocide and uses some of the tactics that we see more frequently in the US, like surrounding clinics and holding up very graphic signs and using intimidation and threatening language to try to scare people away who are accessing the clinic or even threatening staff. So some of the current campaigns that are in place in the UK, the two primary ones that you might know about are the campaign to decriminalize abortion and the campaign to enact buffer zones around clinics. So this was actually a bit of a win. So just very recently, I think this was only announced a couple of weeks ago, that as of 31st of October of this year, so just in a couple of weeks' time, there will be a 150-meter safe access zones around all abortion clinics in England and Wales. Whereas before it was done clinic by clinic. So this is something you might know. It was started in Ealing, so sometimes it was referred to as the Ealing buffer zone. So that's the clinic that's pictured there. So as you can see, the clinic behind in this photo of people holding signs, that's the clinic in Ealing. And because it's on a green, that was a really perfect place for protesters to stand outside and harass people because there was really no way to go around them because they had to go past this large grassy common to get to the clinic. And there was just a lot of harassment going on there. So Ealing Council enforced this buffer zone, and then there were a few other councils in local areas in London and elsewhere in the UK that enforced this buffer zone as well. But there's been a lot of work in abortion campaigning groups to get this to be a nationwide measure, and that thankfully just passed. So that's really, really great and encouraging news. Then there's the campaign for decriminalisation. So it's with many groups, but you might often see it led by BPAS. They do a lot of work around decriminalisation. But the efforts to decriminalise it have continually been shot down, delayed, or abandoned in Parliament. In fact, there was meant to be a vote on this to decriminalise abortion in with the, forgive me for getting the name wrong, but it was a something in justice bill that was supposed to be voted on in the spring. And then when the election was announced, that was canceled and it has so far not been rescheduled. So it's always getting pushed off the docket, pushed to the side, shuffled down the end of the list. So we must keep, must keep vocal, we must keep fighting. And keep pressure on our MPs to hold this vote because it's really important that we try to get this enshrined in law because again, as we've seen with what happened in the US, that all it can take is some slow chipping away at lowering the gestation and then restricting access and allowing anti-choice groups to have more access to politicians. And then before we know it, things can start to really change dramatically. So we really can't be complacent, even in the UK, where we feel like it's very well protected. It's something we should always be thinking about and pushing to have it actually become law that is actually legal and not illegal with just some caveats on it. And also the thing that surprises people, I think, is that the UK has some of the harshest punishment in the world for breaking abortion law, including imprisonment for life. And there are, in fact, some women who have been prosecuted recently. It's risen. More women have been prosecuted in the last 2 or 3 years than they had in the previous, I think, 50 years put together, and having their children removed from their care for procuring an abortion illegally. So there was one particular case that you might have heard of where a woman was accused of lying about how many weeks along she was to be able to access the telemeds, the abortion pills that were mailed to her home. And she was further along than she thought, and she's been penalized for that, had her children removed from her care, and has been prosecuted for that as a crime. So it is something we need to really be aware of. These are just some of the advocacy and support organizations that are out there. There's many, many out there, but these are some of the main ones you might want to look into if you're looking for somewhere to start. Abortion Support Network is great. Abortion Rights as well. Abortion Rights UK. And then Abortion Talk is a great helpline. So for information about abortion services and sister supporter. They were very instrumental in the buffer zone law, and they provide clinic escort. So if you do live or work around somewhere that you're worried about going to access care without somebody with you, they can offer you some support for going into the clinic if you have to go alone. So some of the ways to get involved in abortion activism: follow activist organizations. So the ones that I just mentioned, ourselves, any of the other abortion rights and reproductive rights organizations out there, follow their work, keep on top of what they're doing, what's happening out there, read stories about it when it comes up, donate to and join at least one. It's really important that we have the funds to keep going. So many of these are grassroots organizations. Write to your MP regularly, especially if you have an MP who voted in that last vote or is openly anti-choice or abstains from votes, because that usually speaks a lot as well if they abstain from votes or decline to speak about their stance on it. And just continue to talk about it openly. That's, if nothing else, talking about abortion openly and helping to remove some of the stigma and taboo around it, as a person to person. If you have your own experience to share it with people if you feel comfortable. It doesn't have to be on social media or in a really open public forum, but even talking about it to a friend. And you might be surprised that somebody might say, "Oh, me too." And you find a lot of people who have had those experiences who've never talked about it with anybody. And even if you've not had that experience, just being vocal about your support for abortion rights can be really empowering for people and for yourself as well, just because it can help you to remind yourself of why it's so important to you and to not take that right for granted. Because we really can't be complacent, as we've seen with what's happened in the US. We have to remain vocal and vigilant and ensure access remains in place and is even improved in certain areas, because access is dwindling in certain areas, and that's something else we need to keep an eye on. Right, and that is the majority of my presentation now. So if anybody has any questions, or if you just want to share anything, any thoughts, or if you are involved in abortion work or campaigning, I'd love to hear a bit more about what the work that you do, anything at all. It's very casual, so please do come off mic if you want to say anything. Any questions from anybody? Did you know most of this? I'm curious if anybody kind of knew and it was any of this new information. Somebody type it. Yeah, you can type it in the chat if you want. I'm just curious to know if this was something that a lot of people already kind of know about, or if it was any of it was surprising to you. I think a lot of people are surprised when I talk to people in the UK. They're very surprised, not only by, and I think actually people in the UK often know more about what's happening in the US than they do in the UK sometimes, because just it's in the news more. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just reading a comment. To be honest, my head is spinning hearing about the power that others have over women's health and rights. Yes, injustice overload. Yes, it is a heavy topic. And yes, someone else said knew some, suspected some in terms of the anti-choice activity in the UK. Yeah, it is worrying that the funding, especially that it's increased. The fact that US groups are actually coming over, and some of them are even coming over and providing training to the anti-choice groups on how to get around the law and how to use their tactics in a very roundabout way so that they don't get arrested. So yeah, it's very worrying. Yeah, I think we just can't be complacent. Definitely, it's something we really have to really keep campaigning for and about. Getting that law set in stone is so important. Somebody else just said, I've seen a lot on the news around protests outside clinics and was pleased to see the new law regarding buffer zones. Yes, absolutely. It's really important that we have those buffer zones, because even though with the clinic I worked at, I didn't see a whole lot of protesting going on. There were some, thankfully, just because the location I worked at, it was on quite a busy, narrow street right in front of a bus stop. And the few times we did get somebody standing in front, they were basically blocking the bus stop, and South Londoners would quickly move them on, which was great. Yeah, but it would happen sometimes, and definitely places that were in more accessible areas where protesters can stand around were definitely threatened more. Yeah. So I just had a question in the comments as well. With regards to the criminal convictions from medical professionals in the US, what is the sentencing or repercussions of this typically? So as far as I'm aware, no healthcare professionals have been prosecuted yet since Roe was overturned, but the laws are in place in those states where it is completely prohibited that if the healthcare provider intervenes before the point at which the woman's life is in danger, so that's the key point, is that who is determining when the woman's life is in danger? Normally, that would be the healthcare provider to be able to assess that and to say what their reasonable clinical opinion is. But what's happening now is that because of that caveat in the law that says they can only intervene when her life is an imminent threat to her life, then you have a legal team on the phone with them basically saying, like, what is her heart rate? What are the, what's the situation? And then it's a legal team telling that healthcare professional whether they can act or not. And that's the part that is so mad because they're putting healthcare professionals in the position of, if you do this too soon, you could be sacked from your job, so lose your livelihood, and that you could potentially be prosecuted. Which I don't know the exact laws in different states. It varies what the actual punishment is, but there are definitely, especially in the places where it's really prohibited, like Texas and some of the more southern states, that the punishment is quite severe. I don't know if it's life in prison, but it's very severe. Yeah. I personally I'm wondering, I understand why why healthcare professionals wouldn't want to risk their livelihood in a prison sentence, but as a midwife, part of me does kind of go, if enough of them banded together, like, and they just said, we refuse to do this, we're going to treat this person, like, would they really put them all in prison? I don't know. I know that nobody wants to be the person to test that theory, but part of me does wonder whether healthcare professionals could do a little bit more to try to kind of band together and do the right thing, because that must also be really horrible for them to not be able to, adhere to their medical ethics and their code to protect people and care for people. It must be absolutely horrible. Yeah, just reading some of the comments here. Glad that buffer zones have been put in place and good to know places that support my patients in the future. Thank you again. You're very welcome. I don't understand how they are not prosecuted for saving the life of the woman as chose not to act when at critical point and already too late. So wrong. Yes, absolutely. I really don't. I really can't wrap my head around it, but clearly it's something that people don't feel comfortable that they're able to do. So yeah, I can't blame individual people, but I really do genuinely hope that something happens soon. I think maybe sadly, the more deaths there are, the more maternal deaths there are, potentially that might spur more healthcare providers into action. But really, genuinely, it's probably going to take, again, as it always does, a grassroots, people-led revolution, people, in the streets, people, you know, refusing to do day-to-day things like their jobs if they're a healthcare professional in maternity. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach of not only the law, but a social movement. And I think that's, again, something we have to be really mindful of, is that it's not just about trying to change the law, it's changing people's minds, and not only changing their minds, because even the people who agree with abortion rights and are pro-choice can be very complacent and not really feel that they don't feel moved enough to go out into the streets and advocate for it or to really campaign for it, but they promote it, or are for it in theory, but they're not really prepared to do anything about it because it might not personally affect them, until of course it does affect them, or a family member or a friend or someone they love who's not able to access that care, or who can't get care and while they're having a miscarriage, and then all of a sudden they do really care passionately about it. So I would just urge everyone to not wait until, if you are in the US or you know someone in the US, to not wait until you're at that point. And indeed here, really to not only care about this issue if it affects you personally, or if you're a healthcare professional working in that, but anybody who cares about that right that all women should have to rights over their body and bodily autonomy should be caring about this issue, because it can extend to all different areas as well. And one other thing I wanted to just mention is that one of the other kind of insidious ways that this happened in the US is with some of the fetal personhood laws. So that's where it kind of started with if, say, a pregnant woman was murdered or she was in a car accident while pregnant and her fetus were killed and the driver was drunk, for example. These are real cases that happened. And that person, they changed the law so that that person could be charged with the murder of both the mother and the unborn child. And so, even though those were well meaning laws to begin with, one could argue, and I have heard suggestions like that in the UK as well. The problem with that is that once we start assigning personhood to fetuses, that's exactly the kind of slippery slope that the anti choice movement used to get these court cases in front of the Supreme Court. So, it starts with assigning personhood to fetuses, getting into people's minds that abortion is, awful, terrible, and it's only these, feckless people who don't use contraception that are using it. And then all it takes is that perfect storm of these certain laws coming into effect and swaying public opinion, and then changing, getting lawmakers to actually pass a law, and then all of a sudden you have that perfect storm for something like the overturn of Roe v. Wade. So yeah, it's something we need to be mindful of. There's been attempts to, any attempts to like lower the gestation, or there's been attempts in the past in the UK to make like drinking alcohol in pregnancy a crime, or for, bartenders or off licenses to be able to refuse to serve pregnant women. And the reason why that's been so vociferously shouted down by pro-choice movements and abortion activists is because we know that is the slippery slope to criminalizing it, to assigning personhood to fetuses, which then trump the person who's carrying them's rights. So that's another thing we need to be wary of. So it's not even always about abortion. Sometimes it's about things that are related to pregnancy and fetuses. Yeah, that we need to look out for as well. Somebody had a question here. Just wondering if there are any research initiatives exploring options such as transplanting, freezing, donating of embryos in the same way that eggs can be donated. I fully support access to abortion, but also think there should be ongoing research into other options as well. I don't know exactly what you mean. Do you mean instead of someone having an abortion that they would transplant the embryo, like donate the embryo? As far as I know, that is not something that is happening. I mean, if somebody's gone through IVF and they have leftover embryos, those can be donated, and they are. It doesn't happen very frequently, but it does happen that people can adopt, for all intents and purposes, an embryo that is not either of their genetic material and then have that implanted into them. But that is very much done at that person's choice and is almost always from a couple or a person who has already undergone IVF and they already have the embryos that are kind of left over and they don't need them anymore, and they choose to donate them to somebody else. I would be very against any idea of somebody who's pregnant being forced or coerced or even encouraged to donate that embryo in the same way that eggs can be donated, because it's just not the same. It's still a degradation of their bodily autonomy. And it's, pregnant women are not there to provide children and fetuses and eggs for other people. That's reproductive labor. And that is, again, if they're not doing that willingly, then that's a degradation of their reproductive rights as well. And somebody else had a question about, I've heard some US states are looking to limit access to contraception as well. Is that true? Yes, not all of the ones where it's prohibited have done that or are actively seeking to make it harder to access, but they've not done anything to improve access either. So, but some have. So in some states, they're actually seeking to outlaw like family planning clinics, any kind of sexual health education in schools. You may have heard about in Florida, they have a law that's kind of bundled in with what they're kind of colloquially calling the Don't Say Gay law, where they're basically there's a big campaign in Florida by their governor to outlaw any mention of LGBTQ people, any mention of consent, issues of consent and contraception use that's outside of marriage. And yeah, there are some states, not many, but there are a handful of states in the US who are actively seeking to repress that information and not make that available in schools. And there are schools already, especially in Florida, I think Texas, and a couple of other US states where they are removing books from school libraries that have information about contraception and sexual health in them. So yes, and access to contraception is already a different thing in the US, it's not free mostly, unless you have really good insurance that covers it. A lot of people have to pay for their contraception out of pocket. So some plans won't even cover that, even if you have health insurance. So they might be having to go and pay for the birth control pill or the injection or whatever it is they're using. And if their insurance won't cover it, especially if they're on a low income on Medicaid, probably not going to have it covered for certain instances, where they might have to, again, have to travel very far to find a provider that accepts that insurance and so on. So access is definitely limited. It's not necessarily banned altogether in certain places, but it's difficult to access. Yeah. Right. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you. I hope that was informative. And if you think of any other questions, I'll be here for a couple more minutes in the chat. But otherwise, if you think of anything, you can find me on Instagram on amity.reed or on WRA_UK. On email, I'm amity@whiteribbonalliance.org.uk. And then you've got my website as well, which is just amityreed.com. And I hope you enjoyed the talk tonight. And we obviously did this as just an informative workshop. We want people to become more aware. If you did want to donate to our Big Give campaign, which is running until Thursday at noon, then we would be very grateful, but it's not expected. Okay, thank you very much for attending, and I hope you have a lovely evening. Take care, everyone.